Welcome, and we're so glad that you're here for another mental health and wellness chat. I'm Brittany, and I'm here with
Madison,
and we're two of your VC Counseling Center counselors.
an associate.
And we're here to have real conversations about emotional challenges that students face and explore navigating them. Today's episode, we're going to dive into a common misunderstanding, this idea that depression is just feeling sad. But the truth is, depression can look very different, from feeling tired or numb to losing interest in things that you used to love. It's not always about crying or being visibly down. So today we're going to unpack what depression really is, how to recognize it, and why understanding the difference matters for yourself and for the people around you. So this is the topic of the day, the question of the day, the difference between clinical depression and everyday sadness, because they are obviously two very different things, right? I mean, clinical depression is in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, that in counseling, it's mostly used for insurance purposes and then for research purposes too. And then obviously we have the normal everyday sadness that we experience as humans. So really everyone feels sad sometimes, but depression, among other things, is when that sadness becomes persistent, heavy, and generally interferes with your life. And we come back to this a lot in this podcast when we talk about when things become a problem. And a lot of the times it's when, like we've said, you can no longer function, you can't do things that you usually would do. It interferes with, multiple areas of your life. And it generally keeps you from functioning. So usually when we talk about depression as a disorder, it's usually broken down by physical, cognitive, or, thought related, and then general impairment, right? So just some general common symptoms of depression: fatigue, lack of motivation, changes in sleep and appetite, and then loss of interest in things that we used to do. So when I just list these symptoms out, I feel like it doesn't do them justice either. When we talk about fatigue, we're talking about, feeling tired all the time. No matter how much I sleep, I'm still tired. No matter how much I exercise, I'm still physically tired. Mental fatigue and physical fatigue, right? Lack of motivation. What we mean by that is I cannot bring myself to do my schoolwork or to pay my bills or to do these things that need to be done. Whereas I feel like that's another good distinction between sadness and depression, right? Is if I'm just sad, I can usually still find enough motivation to, get up and go to class, or I can find enough motivation to pay my bills because I recognize that that's going to have a negative impact and I have to do that thing. Changes in sleep or appetite. Usually this looks like I sleep excessively. So I'm sleeping every day, most of the day, or I can't sleep at all. And then it can also look like eating too much and gaining weight, or not eating at all and losing a lot of weight. And I think that's the big difference is, if I'm sad, I might skip a couple of meals versus if I'm depressed, I skip so many meals that I experience a visible weight loss and I've lost, 10 pounds. So once again, we're anchoring back in severity and the impact that it has on you over a long period of time. And then when we talk about loss of interest, really we mean, I'm not going to class anymore because I don't really care about my major and I don't really care to continue working for something because I just don't see the point in working for anything. And then same thing too with like hobbies or activities, right? So we just stop doing those because we just don't see a point anymore in doing those things for some people.
Absolutely. And that's something I hear a lot, I used to, exercise. I used to journal, be like into arts and crafts. And now lately I just have not had any interest for that at all. And it just feels like it just comes out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And that's hard because those things are important to incorporate into your life because they bring you joy. They bring you, calm and can help you de-stress from all of life's events. So whenever that motivation to engage in those things, that interest is gone, that can really play a significant impact in your life. And I think with all those symptoms that you just described, with a few of them, there's like a huge continuum of like, either I'm not sleeping enough or I'm sleeping too much, or I'm not eating enough or I'm eating too much, and it just presents differently for most people, but it really does have a significant impact on your life and is a huge difference from our normal functioning.
Yeah.
So absolutely. And another thing that people with depression experience is negative self-talk and intrusive thoughts. Negative self-talk is, the kind of inner voice that we use whenever we're thinking about ourselves. It's easy to be really critical of ourselves whenever we're experiencing clinical depression. We can have thoughts such as, I'm not good enough, I'm a failure, I'll never amount to anything in life. And whenever we tell ourselves these thoughts enough, we can easily start to believe them. And, our actions and our emotions can all come together. Like our thoughts, behaviors, emotions are all related in some way. So if we're constantly thinking these negative thoughts about ourselves, then there's a good chance that we may not perform well in school, or we may not, reach the goals that we set for ourselves because we've already kind of gotten in the way of ourselves from doing that. We've just I'm trying to think of the words, but we're mentally holding ourselves back without even realizing it, because what we believe does become true for a lot of people. So that can be really, difficult to constantly have those negative thoughts floating around in your head. It can really impact, how you view yourself, your self-esteem, your self-confidence. And that can, be something that takes a really big hit for people.
And another note on intrusive thoughts, I do want to drive home that these thoughts, in my experience and hearing other people's experiences, a lot of times they really jump in. And when I say intrusive, I mean those thoughts pop up with no warning out of nowhere and say, hey, no one cares about you. Hey, no one would miss you if you weren't here. Hey, you're never going to do anything right. Or why do you even care about this? I like to think of it as almost like it feels like a third party that pops in and just starts chiming in about things sometimes for some people. And like we said, it's usually negative and it's usually very pessimistic and it's usually very hopeless is the theme of the thoughts that, nothing I do matters, nothing I can do matters. And even if I wasn't here, things might be good. And I'm dancing here with this example on the edge of suicidal thinking or suicidal ideation too, which is also not uncommon in major depression. It's one of the most common mental disorders that experiences suicidal thoughts. Which we'll touch on a little bit more in a little bit, but another really common symptom that I feel like is overlooked, obviously most of the time people think about depression and they think about sad and they think about crying, which yes, is part of depression for some people, is sadness, crying, plus or minus, it's kind of optional. But something important to note is that another really common symptom can be irritability and anger. We especially see this in male identifying students or marginalized groups, and we even see it in women sometimes too. But I say this to say that, depression doesn't have to look like sad. For some people, depression can actually look like anger, and depression can look like having less patience or being easy to blow up, or irritability too. I think it comes down to the underlying message and emotion under the anger. Is the anger fed by depression and sadness? So I want to make sure that we noted that too, because I feel like that's a common misunderstanding that people have, is that depression equals crying, when it absolutely does not.
Absolutely. And I know there's times when we talk about anger being a secondary emotion that usually is protecting a more sensitive and vulnerable emotion that's harder to, talk about, especially maybe whenever you're a male or, like you said, that marginalized communities. So that's always a good kind of question. Like, what is this anger protecting you from? Sometimes anger even feels like a more acceptable emotion to demonstrate. Opposed to, that sadness, just like that depression that you're experiencing. So that's also something that I think about often. And I think it's a good point to bring up for listeners to hear. So maybe they can connect to that and say like, hey, is this anger or is this really sadness that I am experiencing? For sure. Another common thing that people with, clinical depression experience is just this feeling that their body is very heavy and it's hard to get out of bed. And it's easy to think whenever maybe you hear that, oh, that person's just lazy, like, come on, just get out of bed. Like, it's easy. But for someone with, clinical depression, it's not that easy at all. It's a daunting task that, like, it can feel so difficult just because that fatigue, like we were talking about earlier, feels so intense. Even if you got maybe like 16 hours of sleep, you still feel like, oh my gosh, I can't get up. I can't do anything. And that can obviously interfere with your ability to carry out tasks and responsibilities, and, going to your classes, just socializing with others. So that one symptom can really impact a lot of things, for sure.
And that's the thing about depression, is that it is a self-sustaining cycle to a degree. Like, there's theories about depression that if we give in to what depression wants and we lay in bed all day and we don't see anyone, don't do anything, and we sleep all day, then we never really have an opportunity to ever feel better when that's what we're doing, right? If I'm just laying in bed with my negative thoughts, chances are, if I were, let's say, to get up and to brush my teeth, that gives me an opportunity to feel like, wow, I got up and brushed my teeth.
Yeah.
So it gives us depression self-sustains in that way, where the more that we engage what depression motivates us to do, the less likely we are to ever feel better. So the more likely we are to feel depressed. And a common thought or comment that we hear, or that, obviously people experience, is this guilt of, I have a good life. Why would I feel this way? Sometimes with depression, there's no identifiable trigger. We know that depression is a neurological condition that, obviously brains are wired a little bit differently. So even when everything is going well in our life, it is possible to have a depressive episode in the midst of that. And a lot of times that can lead to guilt of, I don't have a reason to feel this way. I hear that so much. There's no reason for me to feel like this. Why would I feel this way? But the thing is that depression can kind of distort our thinking, right? So it's not uncommon for people to feel excessive guilt, hopelessness, despite evidence to the contrary, feeling generally worthless, or believing that things are never going to get better. And I think that's the biggest lie that depression tells us, is that I'm always going to feel this way forever. So even if these thoughts don't align with reality, sometimes depression, remember, circling back to intrusive thoughts, it throws these thoughts in the mist that, we just kind of roll with. And unfortunately, that's where depression can start spiraling to. And sometimes, in some cases, this can lead to suicidal thoughts or ideations for some people. Which, if you are experiencing that and you're listening to this video because you're worried that you might be depressed, always absolutely reach out. If you have suicidal thoughts or ideations, if you look at the picture on this video, 988 is the National Suicide and Crisis Hotline. Depending on where you live, there's also local MHMRs that usually have 24-hour crisis response teams. Here in Victoria, ours is Gulf Bend. And you can give them a call and they can send someone to your location to have a conversation with you and talk. So this is obviously important to note because, suicidal thoughts are so common with depression that if you're experiencing that, absolutely reach out, speak with someone, and get yourself in a safe place, because your safety matters more than anything. So it's important to recognize that, these thought patterns for a lot of people can lead to suicidal thoughts, which, logically makes sense. If I truly believe that life is never going to get better, I'm always going to feel this awful, there's nothing that I can do to change it, I'm the problem in everyone's life, it would make sense. But at the end of the day, like I said, it's the biggest lie that depression tells, is that things will never get better, because, that's what life does. It ebbs and flows. There are ups and downs. There are times where you're going to feel better, and there are times where you might feel worse. But it's important to recognize that all emotions in most life circumstances are temporary by nature.
Absolutely. And, just kind of jumping back to your point where we have these thoughts that are fueled by depression that say, no matter what I do, nothing's going to get better. So why try? That can make it easy to fall into that cycle of not seeking help, of not trying to make these lifestyle changes and, just evidence-based practices that can help depression. But whenever you're in that negative headspace, of course, it feels like nothing will get me out of this. So why even bother? But it sounds cliche, but just because we have a thought doesn't mean that it's true. Doesn't mean it's a fact. So that's why a big part of, therapy is, identifying those thoughts and working to restructure them and just make them more realistic and just give you that outsider point of view, because it's so easy to be closed off to what can help, but there are so many things. I think that's an important point to make.
Well, and because too, on top of it, depression is one of the most well-researched, well-funded mental disorders in terms of treatment and modalities and options and alternatives. Obviously depression has been one of the older recognized mental health disorders. So there is a lot of evidence-based research backing depression and the treatment of depression. So that is the good news in that.
When it comes to clinical depression, there can be a lot of shame around struggling whenever it seems like others are thriving. And I think with social media, it definitely makes it a lot more obvious to see people's lives. Obviously, social media is a highlight reel, so it looks like everybody's doing amazing, living their best life all the time. And whenever someone with depression sees something like that, it's easy to be like, well, why am I going through such a difficult time? Why do I feel like I can barely get out of bed, do the tasks and responsibilities that are expected of me? And these people are, just doing it all, living it up. It's like, what's the difference from me and them? It can be easy to be really hard on yourself about that, which of course just fuels this cycle of the negative thoughts, negative emotions, and then behaviors that maybe we don't want to get better because we just feel like nothing's going to help. It's all a cycle that can just be exacerbated by this social comparison.
Well, and I feel like too, we've talked about this before, but I feel like as a species, we tend to underestimate everyone's ability to fake fine most of the time, like, for example, even within yourself, right? Think back to the last time that you were really struggling with something internally and you had to go to work or class or whatever it might be. You probably put on a pretty good face around strangers, basically. I mean, maybe not to your spouse, partner, friend, whoever, but when you have to put yourself in a social situation like class, for example, most people are going to do their best to get through that without anyone knowing what they're feeling, because that's just kind of what we do as a defense mechanism, right? Other people are uncomfortable with us being honest about our emotions. Like if, in the hallway, if you were to ask someone, hey, how are you doing? And they say, fine. And you say, no, really, what are you struggling with right now? Most people aren't going to be open to that conversation. And most people don't want to have that conversation, unfortunately. So I feel like we underestimate that. And it's easy to sit in class or in a meeting or at work and look around and be like, oh my gosh, everyone else is fine. I'm the only one struggling so much. When in reality, even if they were struggling, most people aren't going to let you see that.
And they're not going to tell you that explicitly.
That, we kind of put these fronts on, and that's just part of being human. But it's important to remember that other people might not be as fine as you perceive them to be.
That's such a good point. Yep, absolutely. We truly, another cliche, we truly never know what people are going through. Like you can see someone who generally looks so happy and like they're doing so great in life, and then you hear something down the line and it's like, oh my God, I never would have guessed that they were going through that. They hid it so well, they function so well. And that's something that we're going to kind of touch on here in a few minutes as well.
Well, and I think that's a good point to make too. And the difference between just feeling sad and depression too, is that with just sadness, usually when I reach out to someone else and connect, I can feel a little bit better. Whereas with depression, that's not going to happen. Sometimes it might happen a little bit, but the depression comes right back and it's persistent. And same thing too, if I'm just sad, I can take all these reasonable points the two of us just listed and say, you know what, that's probably true, and start to feel a little bit better. But if I'm depressed, that negative thought comes back in and it's like, no, you really are that awful. And everyone else really is doing that much better than you. So I think this is the difference between depression and sadness too. This even drives that point home. Sadness is usually time limited. There's usually an end date. It's usually based on a specific life event. And you can usually point to it and say, well, yeah, I'm sad because this happened. Whereas depression, that's not necessarily the case. So those are important things to note. And then on top of it, there is such thing as smiling depression, which is just high functioning depression, right? It's where, we've been depressed, and you usually see this in people with chronic depression. So maybe they've had depression since childhood or adolescence, and now they're an adult. And this is something that they've been coping with. So, humans are amazingly resilient creatures, that sometimes when this is something that's just our norm, we develop a skill to be able to just kind of put this mask on in public and seem fine, seem normal, function, right? But underneath that mask, a lot of times we might feel really, really numb or disconnected inside. And for some people, this is just kind of how they function in general. And like I said, a lot of times it's tied to, they've just been doing this for so long, they've learned to adapt and cope and overcome to a degree.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard people say, I haven't feel like I have had a genuine laugh in so long. And they're still laughing, they're still doing the things, but it just doesn't feel genuine, authentic to themselves. And it's almost like it's numbed or blunted to a certain effect. So absolutely. Another common thing we hear from people experiencing depression is that they feel like a burden. And, whenever people are experiencing depression, there may be times when they need more support, more assistance in general areas of their life. And that's great. I'm sure that there's people who do want to help them. But to someone who has depression, it's easy to start having thoughts like, oh my gosh, I'm inconveniencing these people. my neediness is starting to put stress on these people, so I shouldn't even reach out. It's too much for them. I'm just going to, figure it out myself, do it myself. And whenever you have those thoughts of feeling like, you're too much, you're an inconvenience, that can really prevent someone from reaching out with others and having that connection. And that can just fuel, that isolation.
Yeah.
Which is not great for people with depression at all.
Yeah. And I feel like another thing too is even this belief of, even if I did reach out, I don't know what's wrong. I don't know why I should feel this way. So what am I even going to talk to him about, even if I did reach out, where, sometimes just reaching out and saying to someone like, hey, I'm feeling really down. Can we just kind of couch rot together? Can be a good compromise to that too. I mean, you don't have to have something to talk about, but sometimes just connecting with someone can help in those moments too. And depression usually has a pretty big component of not being able to enjoy anything at all. And this is another big sticking point in the difference, is that when I'm sad, I can still do something enjoyable and enjoy it. Whereas with clinical depression, for a lot of people, there's this inability to feel happy at all. There's this inability to enjoy anything at all. And I can't underscore this point enough if you've never experienced it, what that feels like. But this is a big key difference between sadness and actual depression that's worth noting. For sure.
Another good topic is the fact that cultural norms do affect the way that we express and suppress symptoms of depression. There are certain cultures who are more critical of depression. They may view it as an illegitimate, condition that people experience, something that is like a personal failing or a weakness. And whenever you come from a culture that views depression that way, it can really make a big impact on whether or not you're seeking help.
Well, and even too, looking at your parents too, a lot of times I hear from students that, I was always told my whole life that depression is just sad and everyone's sad. So you just need to stop being sad is basically the expectation, which, yes, we can argue sometimes, obviously, cultural expectations play into that too. But obviously, if this is the perspective that I'm coming from, asking for help is going to be extremely challenging to impossible, right? Because now I'm losing family support by seeking professional help. I risk that. I also risk judgment of family that, oh my gosh, you're going to a therapist for feeling sad. Just we got over sadness by just deciding we weren't going to be sad anymore. What's wrong with you? That, you know what I mean? It almost, for some people, it gives this perception that they're a victim and that's unacceptable in some way, or even the traditional hypermasculine view of depression, right? That if I'm depressed, then that means I'm weak. And if I'm weak, then I don't have worth. So I can't admit that, even if it were true. So these are important things to consider too. And even family expectations and the whole strong narrative, right? That I need to be strong, that depression is weak or asking for help is weak in some way. And obviously, I would love if we could make a podcast episode that could change everyone's mind on this perspective. But I could just keep driving home the point that depression is a chemical imbalance within our brain, much like alcoholism, much like, a lot of other disorders and actual organic diseases that cause a structural change. And for some people, when we do have clinical depression, that is something that's lifelong. And it's not something that, you can just make up your mind that you're not going to feel anymore. A lot of the times, it's unrealistic.
Yeah. And just the biggest point is just that you're not weak. You can't control what you're feeling. And like you said, it is a long-term thing. And whenever you don't have that support from others and make you feel like you're not being genuine, like you shouldn't feel that way, it can be really hard. But it's also important to point out that as we've adapted, in society, I do feel like there has been a lot more acceptance and openness about depression, and people can be very, understanding of what you are going through and, encourage help seeking behaviors. So of course, there's one side of it where it can be viewed as weak and not a real thing that people go through, but there's also another side of it where people genuinely do want to help. They do want to be there for you. So they can both things can exist. Absolutely. So I do have a question for you, Brittany. I was wanting to know, what do you wish that more people understood about depression?
There's so many things. I feel like I'm going to go with kind of what we talked about earlier, though, that depression is one of the most researched, evidence-based like the treatments are very real researched and evidence-based, and that treatment can be effective for a lot of people, most people. I also feel like it's important to note too that, you know, there's a lot of options for treatment as well. So it doesn't just have to be therapy. And honestly, we find the most effective treatment includes medication and therapy for most people with clinical depression.
Combination.
And this is obviously different for each person, right? Some people can manage their depression without medication, and some people cannot manage their medication without, or they can't manage their depression without medication. So it's such an individual process. And then, you know, I know the process feels overwhelming, especially when you're depressed, but therapy can be a good place to start because we can help connect you with medication evaluations and, you know, help you kind of understand the different options and help you navigate that process to make it less overwhelming and cumbersome for you. So I think that would be my answer, would be just that medication treatment for depression is really effective for most people, especially something so high risk. And I say that in terms of suicidal ideation and thoughts, right? That these lifestyle changes or therapy, you know, there's a lot of different options that we can go about this. And a lot of them are very backed by science and very evidence-based. So always get help.
So many different treatment options that you can seek out if that's something that you're interested in. So I think that's an encouraging note for sure.
So, okay, Madison, what do you think that someone can be depressed and still go to class, socialize, and appear normal?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's kind of what we were touching on earlier, you know, that high functioning depression where you are experiencing the symptoms of depression, you know, internally. But like we were saying, you know, you get so used to your routines, and it just doesn't impact your functioning as much. You are still able to show up, take care of business, but it doesn't, you know, minimize what you are feeling. It's still very real.
Yeah.
But it does happen. Absolutely.
No, absolutely. Well, any other thoughts, comments, concerns that you want to say before we wrap up, Madison?
I think just, of course, the topic of this video, depression is more than sadness. Just remembering that, you know, it's okay if you are going through something like this. It does not make you weak. Nothing is wrong with you. You know, we just want you to feel ready to get the help that you need if that's something that you feel is right for you.
And therapy is always free here at the Counseling Center for VC counseling or for VC students.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's all I've got. So thank you so much for joining us today in your go-to space for honest conversations about mental health and well-being. We're your hosts, Madison
and Brittany,
and we're glad that you spent part of your day with us. Remember that taking care of your mind is just as important as taking care of your body. Be kind to yourself, reach out if you need support, and know that you're never alone. Until next time, take care and take a deep